We must not forget what we can all do to fight this virus, which is to wash our hands. You knew I was going to say this, but wash our hands with soap and water.
Okay, how long should I wash them?
For the length of time it takes to sing Happy Birthday twice.
Right, okay, wash hands for length of time it takes to sing Happy Birthday twice.
Happy birthday twice.
Okay, anything else?
I want to stress that for the vast majority of the people of this country, we should be going about our business as usual.
Oh, okay, business as usual then. Back to the day job.
There's been a bit of confusing advice about things like shaking hands.
Where's the confusion? Obviously, everyone should avoid doing that.
No, well, Victoria, I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
Oh, right, so actually it's fine to go to a hospital full of coronavirus patients and shake hands with absolutely everybody. Is that right?
I think the scientific evidence is, well, I'll hand over to the experts, but our judgment is wash. Washing your hands is the crucial thing.
Yeah, wash your hands while you sing Happy Birthday twice.
Before you shake hands, obviously.
Yes, right, but not after. Got it.
Downing Street has just confirmed that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has tested positive for a coronavirus.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been admitted to hospital.
Britain's Prime Minister is in intensive care this morning after his fight with the coronavirus took a troubling turn.
In the UK, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has left intensive care after 3 nights.
Boris Johnson is now out of the hospital just days after being released from intensive care.
I've today left hospital after a week in which the NHS has saved my life. No question.
And go, Rod. Greetings from Teesside and welcome to this debate which will attempt to discover how and why the government seemingly mismanaged the greatest medical crisis to afflict our country in 100 years. The debate marks the launch of a new book which attempts to do likewise. Pandemic, Where Did We Go Wrong? A Very Public Inquiry, edited by John Mayer, which contains evidence and argument from health, economic and political experts, as well as stuff from people like me. That this was a newly elected government dealing with something which was frankly beyond the edge of its comprehension may be taken as a plea of mitigation. Nonetheless, its failures are regarded by many as legion. The charge sheet includes, but is by no means confined to, a terrible slowness to react to COVID. Our borders remained entirely open, with scarcely any testing or quarantine. We were slower to impose lockdown than any of our European allies and failed to call a halt to large-scale sporting events, which may, simply by themselves, have caused large local infection rates. The government at all times insisted that it was following the science, and yet the scientific evidence apparently changed on an almost daily basis. Meanwhile, it is alleged that the elderly were turfed out of their NHS hospital beds and into care homes, and the care homes bunged a wad of cash to take them in, regardless of whether or not these frail people had the virus. The death rate in our care homes was easily the worst per capita in Europe. 4 huge hospitals were built and remained virtually, in some cases, completely unused. Why did the virus apparently pose a greater threat to our black and ethnic minority citizens? We'll be looking at that. And how might we better protect the most vulnerable of us? Even today, the government staggers like a drunk at a Christmas party from one course of action to another, contradictory course of action, often again within the space of about 24 hours. Only Brazil and the USA can match us in our incompetency, if indeed it is incompetency. One thing we need to know is how flawed was the supposedly expert advice given to the government. Further, was the government simply incompetent, or was it insouciant, instinctively considering the virus no big deal and thus disinclined to initiate measures which might damage the economy and indeed impinge upon people's personal liberties and freedom of movement? We might also ask if our response to a virus which in strictly comparative terms was ineffectual in its lethality was a grotesque overreaction which we will be paying for many, many years to come. The point of the debate, though, is less to blame than to learn, not least because waiting around the corner may well be a parasitical organism which poses a rather more pungent threat than COVID-19. COVID accounted for the lives of an estimated 60,000 British people. Some accounts put the figure much higher, some much lower. That is something else we might try to discern. And so let's begin. I will be introducing a range of expert witnesses who will have about 3 minutes to outline their points, and I will then ask questions for a couple of minutes before moving on to the next expert. Your own questions and more general debate will come at the end. Please remember you can email your questions to John Mayer. And so without further ado, I think we should go straight away to one of our most expert of expert witnesses, which is Professor Dave Leon, who is the Professor of Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he has a few words to say about lockdown. Please, take it away, Dave.
Okay, so first of all, I think there's no doubt that the UK has done worse than most other countries, even per capita. I don't think that's up for discussion anymore. I think the metric for measuring that in the number of excess deaths, which per capita are second only in Europe to Spain. And there's no lack of clarity about excess deaths. It's not about the testing regimes or whatever. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of excess deaths, this pandemic dwarfs what has happened with seasonal flu in the UK. It's a much, much bigger deal in the UK. I think the question as to why it's got so bad, essentially when you've got an epidemic disease, which is doubling every 2 to 3 days as it was in March, then the delay of even 1 or 2 days in trying to actually impose some degree of lockdown to actually stop transmission is pretty serious. I think the evidence for it spreading at such a high rate, it wasn't fully evident in early March that what was going on because the data wasn't there, but the government chose not to adopt a precautionary principle, which was used in a number of other countries to great effect, including the Czech Republic, Norway, and so on and so forth. So I think the political instincts of the current government were against doing anything like that. It's interesting to note that Eastern Europe has done much better than Western Europe generally. And I think that probably reflects the instincts of Eastern European governments, which are much less concerned with issues to do with restrictions on intruding in personal liberty. Track and trace, I think there's a lot of confusion here. The key thing, it's not so much purely about how much testing it's done, it's actually about what's done with the testing results. Basically, the UK has not had for a long time an adequate infrastructure which functions. And if you compare it with Germany, Germany has been in the spotlight as being a good example of low excess deaths, handled it well. The crucial thing, it's not just that they were able to test a lot, they actually had a functioning public health infrastructure, which could be scaled up very easily, where basically the lines of accountability, information were well established and it functioned well. So I think the chaos that we've had with testing is actually shown very evidently with the so-called Pillar 2 testing, which has been outsourced to private companies, where there's been inadequate communication with the NHS, with local public health officials. And I think this is illustrating that any government, in my mind, who was sitting in, any prime minister in Downing Street, if this pandemic came along, with the heritage or the lack of heritage of a good public health infrastructure, would have really struggled. So I think that goes back to the Lansley reforms in 2012, where Public Health England arose in 2013, which was not fully equipped and given the tools to be able to control pandemics in a way that I think a more thought through thing would have done, with public health moving into local authorities with inadequate resourcing. I think the in the first few weeks of the pandemic, there was a great Radio 4 program which actually had Mervyn King on it, who is a sort of rather conservative character in his outlook. I think he's been governor of the Bank of England, and he put his finger on it. He said already his view was that this illustrated our lack of looking after strategic infrastructure in the country, and that the whole mentality in the NHS and public health, which is a just-in-time manufacturing notion of just let's be thin and lean about it, will not do in the face of global pandemics. I think one thing to note is the UK, I think, has failed in terms of its ability to protect the public in terms of functioning public health infrastructure. However, there's no doubt that the UK is a world leader in terms of biomedical research per capita. And the recovery trial, which for instance has put dexamethasone on the table as a cheap and effective part of the treatment regime, is a remarkable product of that, and other things will come out. So I think we've got this thing of, on the one hand, Britain is great in terms of biomedical science, in terms of its trials infrastructure, but in terms of practical things, we've really struggled. One word about care homes. I think it's a moot point. Is it something about how badly or well care homes are run in different countries, or is it partly a reflection that if you have a very high rate of community transmission, as we have had in this country, inevitably you're going to pull a lot of care homes into things? I'm not being saying that there was nothing that could be done about it, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily a verdict that our care homes are much worse than other people's. Finally, the role of the media, I think it's been exceptional in terms of things like BBC, The Guardian, and the FT, who've invested in data journalists over the last years. And I think they've provided a crucial conduit for communicating to many people pertinent aspects of the pandemic.
Dave, thanks very much. Terrific. Couple of questions. There will be some who say that the virus has been overstated in its lethality and will point to what they predict to be a final death count of something in the region of 0.1%, or certainly below 1% of those people who have been afflicted with the virus. Do you think that the government was inclined to believe that this was an outbreak of an ineffectual virus, and that therefore it did not require the sort of alacrity which you would have
I'm not sure that I feel equipped to really give an answer to that. I think exactly what was going through the head of Boris Johnson and his advisors when they were hearing scientific advice is a moot point. I think basically my take on it is that they're sort of the basic libertarian instincts that Johnson has were always getting the better of him, and he couldn't hear in the sense of this is a threat. It's clearly had a really bad effect in China. It's going all over the place, and I don't think it was a careful judgment as to where, oh, this is an ineffectual virus. I think that it was just having a go. It was just sort of, let's take a risk. And in this situation, you don't take risks.
It seems to be, though, doesn't it? I mean, we seem to have some evidence that the scientific advice that the government was being given did itself change. So I do remember Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance both saying that large congregations of people, there was no great problem about this. That was back in March, I think. And we didn't close the borders. It seems as if there did seem to be a stream of either contradictory information going to them, or that information changed over time. Are you able to explain any of that at all, do you think?
Well, no, I think I too have noted and remembered this issue about large congregations of people, whether it was football matches or whatever. Yeah. And I think in retrospect, those were really bad calls. I think the logic of this was that once the epidemic was actually firmly established in the country, having one or two isolated sort of congregations of people even if they involved many thousands, wouldn't necessarily do anything very large. But I think that's probably been shown to be wrong. I think it was just adding fuel to the fire.
It seems to me that at the end of all this, the government, once there is an official public inquiry, the blame will be shifted towards the scientists, but also towards an issue you brought up, which is Public Health England and its perceived bureaucracy and lack of mobility. Do you think that Public Health England itself bears some of the blame for this?
I think I'm very loath to call out Public Health England per se, because as I said in earlier, Public Health England was created out of the Lansley reforms. The Lansley reforms put the everyday function of public health in local authorities. The local authorities have been starved even more of cash than virtually anything else.
So this is basically it's a financial matter.
Pardon? I think it's both a financial matter as well as potentially the fact that Public Health England wasn't given all the tools that it would have required if it was really to deal with a pandemic properly. And that includes proper articulation with local authorities. I think there was a lack of joined up thinking in the very conception of the public health reforms.
Dave, thanks so much. We move now very swiftly. Time is pushing on to Juliet Ricks, who is a freelance journalist, former foreign correspondent for the BBC, and who's written about health issues for The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Times. Welcome, Juliet, and you have your view of what is going on.
Well, throughout this pandemic, Boris Johnson's government has seemed more often to be behind the curve than flattening it. It was almost as if they were doing a Nelson and putting the blind eye to the telescope. So much evidence did they appear to miss. They didn't seem to be seeing what was happening in China, or the warnings in the Lancet, or from the WHO. In February, the EU bulk ordered PPE. Our government missed the email. It held a few COBRA meetings, which the PM didn't attend, and told us to wash our hands, as we saw earlier. They didn't seem to see Italy either, as cases and casualties accelerated amid images of death and overwhelmed hospitals. Our own chief scientific advisor said that we were 4 weeks behind Italy. We were actually 2 weeks behind, but either way, the trajectory was perfectly clear. The government didn't seem to notice cases rising in France and Spain. As hotspot Madrid closed its schools, the UK welcomed 3,000 Madrid fans to a football match in Liverpool. And this was on the 11th of March, the day the WHO declared a pandemic. This government didn't even see the home truths. When Boris Johnson warned on the 16th of March that cases would soon be doubling every 5 or 6 days, our confirmed cases were already doubling every 3 days. How could the government not be seeing this? Unless you believe they had a collective IQ in the tens or actually wanted to kill people, the most charitable explanation seems to be that they were turning a blind eye. Why? Certainly they wanted to avoid shutting down the economy. Well, who wouldn't? But crucially, they thought they could do it by letting the virus sweep through the population, creating herd immunity. This despite the fact that there was and is no proof that contracting the disease actually confers long-term immunity, and we had a shortage of resources and no treatments. With his usual economy with the actualité, Boris quickly denied that herd immunity was the policy, but Sir Patrick Vallance put a figure on it. 60% of the population would need to be infected. It doesn't even take the back of an envelope to work out, even with very conservative assumptions, that that would bring a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. Once embedded, this infection spreads exponentially. So when Neil Ferguson presented his model showing we were heading for 250,000 dead, the figures shouldn't actually have been a surprise. We first knew of Ferguson's model in mid-March, but it's emerged since I wrote the piece for the book that he presented it privately to Sage on the 5th of March. Not 1 week before we finally locked down, but 2.5. Nelson's blind eyeing was carefully judged and successful. This government's not so much. We all know the UK's world-class death toll. So is the government now looking through an eye with vision? It doesn't seem so. We unlocked with COVID cases still in 5 figures, with no effective track and trace. And Boris's messaging has been world-beatingly unclear. The government didn't seem to be seeing Texas or Florida, Australia or Singapore. It took a week to lock down Leicester, and travellers to Spain have just received 0 notice of new quarantine rules, despite the fact that the trend in cases has been visible for a couple of weeks. Pubs were one of the first sectors the government chose to reopen. The next day, the chair of the Police Federation noted that one thing was crystal clear: drunk people can't socially distance. Perhaps we needed Neil Ferguson to model that for us too.
Julia, thanks a lot. A couple of questions. The first, I think, is, as you say, it would seem to be that the government was getting contradictory advice. Doesn't that to a degree exonerate the government? Because you're quite right that there was Neil Ferguson saying one thing and other experts saying other things, such as Chris Whitty, such as Sir Patrick Vallance. The government, which I suspect does not have a science degree within it at any point, therefore had to navigate this path. Do you not feel some sympathy, therefore, with the government put into that position?
I feel a huge amount of sympathy for any government that's had to deal with this. I mean, it's horrendous, and I don't envy them one jot. But I do think that you don't even need to read scientific papers to see what was going on. I mean, the government was not locking us down when you could see what was happening in Italy. I mean, it was all over the news. You could see that their health service, which, by the way, had more space in it than ours does, was overwhelmed. You could see what was happening. It was quite obvious. And unless you think that the British population is somehow a different race of humans from the rest of Europe, it seemed fairly clear where we were going. And in fact, our own scientific advisors said that we were X weeks, they got the wrong number of weeks, but nonetheless behind Italy. So it was clear that this was a trajectory that we were also on. And if that was the case, then it was fairly obvious that something had to be done about it, because if you looked elsewhere, you could see that if something is rising exponentially, it only accelerates, it only moves more quickly, becomes more of a problem unless you find a way of intervening.
I have to say, as I was talking about its insouciance towards the virus, nothing exemplifies it more than the fact that half of the government went down with the virus, and that Boris Johnson, it's that complete lack of regard. It was remarkable. That being said, should the government not have taken, and should we all not have taken, Neil Ferguson's modelling with a pinch of salt, given his modelling on previous occasions, which has come into some criticism?
Well, if you actually look at the way that other scientists have examined the way he created that modelling, there's been a lot of criticism of the way that it was modelled and the type of modelling that he used. I mean, I'm no expert on digital modelling, but he apparently was using some quite old-fashioned ways of doing it. But those scientists, the people who analysed that and said this, also then redid some of it with better ways of doing the data and actually came up with very similar figures. And to be honest, you didn't, as I say, you didn't even have to look at Neil Ferguson's figures. You could see what was happening in other parts of Europe. You could see that until people intervened, this was just rising. And not only was it rising, it was the speed of the rise was picking up, because that's the way that exponential increase works. And I think that's something that's quite hard to understand. And one of the problems with this has been that the government has completely failed to explain to the population what is going on and why, so that people actually understand about exponential rise, that if you don't intervene, it just speeds up and speeds up and speeds up. And if it's doubling every 3 days, you go from quite a small number to quite a high number very quickly.
Indeed, indeed. Juliet's piece is in this book, which is out now and which is what we're talking about. Thanks a lot, Juliet. We move now to a piece of tape from a political advisor. Paul Corrigan is a social scientist. He was also a special advisor on health policy to two new Labour Secretaries of State for Health and indeed for Tony Blair himself. He is now in charge of a blog called Health Matters. This is Paul Corrigan's take.
Three themes that I want to explain as to why the government have managed the COVID crisis so poorly. And all of these take the government ideologically in its own framework and says they actually have a right to have that framework. The first is the government are libertarians who don't believe in telling people what to do. And yet much of the COVID crisis forced them to tell people what to do. They were very recently elected. They were and are a unified government with only Brexit minds in the cabinet, and people were not appointed to the cabinet because they were good at running departments. They were appointed to the cabinet because they believed in Brexit. That means they're profoundly ideological. No one voted for this government because they believed in epidemiology. No one thought Boris Johnson and this government will be very good at dealing with an epidemiological crisis because they were voted in to get Brexit done. And that was leaving people alone. The whole issue of getting Brexit done was creating more liberty for the public. And this has been a theme throughout, even during the explanations of lockdown. So 1 week before lockdown, on March the 16th, Boris Johnson said public have an inalienable right to go down the pub. And the day after lockdown was announced, the Daily Telegraph said it's the end of freedom. And for the next few weeks, much of the Conservative Party was attacking the government for bringing in lockdown, which told people how to live their lives. And indeed, this continued until July, when face masks were made compulsory in shops, and Desmond Swayne referred to this as a monstrous imposition. A large chunk of the Conservative Party and many people in the cabinet believe it is wrong to tell people how to live their lives, but that's in fact what they've had to do. The second issue about this government is it believes passionately in British exceptionalism. It believes that as a nation, we are automatically world beating. And when they talk about the post-Brexit world, they talk about global Britain once more astride the world, making history. On February the 3rd, Boris Johnson made a speech before the crisis really hit in Greenwich, which explained an outline of how we would be after Brexit. And it was all about how we would beat the world. Therefore, it has not been odd to see several times during the crisis, the government claim that this or that thing they were implementing was world beating, when in fact, it was barely there. So claiming world beating is a crucial part of what this government does, and it's continued through the crisis, but actually implementing world beating is the first time they've had the opportunity to do that, and that's not worked very well. The third issue for the government has been their relationship with experts. Famously, Michael Gove in 2016 said the British people had had enough of experts. And the problem for them when the crisis hit was science and scientists became a very important part of the way in which we understood the crisis and what to do. Their distance from science meant that continually they were talking about the importance of following the science, but science, when it confronts an early phenomena, a new phenomena like COVID, is all about disagreement. It will take several years before science comes to a single view of what to do in aspects of lockdown with COVID. And that's because science is essentially about disagreement. And that has meant we've had scientists coming onto social media, quite rightly disagreeing with themselves and disagreeing with the government, because that's the nature of what science is. And so all this leads me to a simple proposition, which is that governments are no good at implementing policies that they don't believe in.
Have we lost Mr. Corrigan? We seem to have lost Paul Corrigan. and sadly I can't ask him any questions about this because he tape recorded, he videoed his contribution to us today, for which we're very grateful. If we get it back, because I think he was just coming to his conclusion, I'm sure we'll play it. There are some questions I would like to ask him, I must say, but never mind. Let's move on. We've had a whole bunch of questions in from people interested in this debate. One of them is saying, why does the BBC only give us half the facts? This is from a woman called Susan Dwight. Is it a deliberate policy of the BBC and the other news outlets to give us only half the facts? And there's been a general worry about the way in which the information has been disseminated, both from government and through the media. And so, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Alex Connick, who is a fellow in marketing at the Sage Business School, Oxford University. Alex.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So Professor Leon said that the media, the BBC and the FT in particular, have been exceptional in this crisis. And I think that's true, but it's only a small part of the story. And my concern is that in the wider information war that's been fought, particularly against dangerous conspiracy theories, actually the British state and mainstream media have really not prospered. In fact, they haven't done at all well, and they've lost the war, essentially. So how would that be? So coronavirus conspiracies, like all conspiracies, kind of have the characteristics of an insurgency. And actually, the British have a long and much vaunted experience at counterinsurgency warfare, but we don't seem to have put it to very good use. So because I have a dull life, I was reading the British Army Field Manual on Countering Insurgency from 2009. And it says, it says many things. It's like 300 pages long, lots of PowerPoints. But the most effective activities are in the psychological domain. And actually, in that psychological domain, that's the place, the kind of social platforms, the Instagrams that feed on people's psychology, where we've done particularly badly. And in fact, the British state hasn't really engaged in Instagram in the same charismatic way that the spreaders of conspiracies have done. And that means we've lost out. And there's plenty of statistics to show that. For example, amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, 45% said to a King's College survey in June, so just last month, that they got much of their information from YouTube, and 40% of the under 35 said Facebook was their source. But then when you actually ask them what they thought about coronavirus, half the population believe it was a man-made creation. 30% thought the coronavirus was created in a lab, it increased from 25%. 13% believe that the pandemic was part of a global effort to force everyone to be vaccinated, and so on and so forth. So all kinds of nonsense has been springing up about coronavirus and has been believed, and that's dangerous because, as an Oxford survey showed, that if people don't believe the government line, then they won't also respect the government's guidance. And so, for example, they won't respect the need to stay 2 meters apart. And as we've already heard today, the exponential risk of any kind of viral outbreak is ongoing. And this is all part of course, of the much wider kind of information war that's been going on with kind of QAnon and the extreme right and so forth, with all the various crazy theories that are out there. And we haven't been doing a good job. So why haven't we been countering this properly? And there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I mean, the BBC, for example, do an excellent job. They have an excellent site on their website, dealing with conspiracy theories. But then there's no push marketing about it. There's no sending that content out to Instagram with the right kind of influencers, for example. Twitter have tried it, but then sometimes they screwed up. For example, they put a COVID-19 label on some of the tweets about 5G, which actually ended up confirming the vaunted link between 5G and coronavirus, when in fact there is no coronavirus link with 5G. So we've got much more to do. And what we need to do is something more akin to what the Lincoln Project have done in America on the right, where they've taken the social media war incredibly effectively to Donald Trump by using that kind of counterinsurgency small unit tactic and fighting the battle in the very spaces, namely Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, where he's traditionally done so well. So it hasn't been going well. It's gone a little better since Facebook came under commercial pressure from major brands. And actually, oddly enough, it's business that may have saved the day here, because by business coming into Facebook and saying that they resented the adjacency that their content was finding on sites like Facebook, Facebook have actually become a little stricter on their takedowns, and that may actually help sort of lower the virality of this stuff. But certainly, we have a long way to go. We're trying to achieve a form of herd immunity from the virus itself, and also from the conspiracy theories around the virus. And that 60% figure probably applies on both platforms. And we're certainly not there yet with respect to conspiracy theories.
Thanks a lot, mate. It seems to me that your at the forefront of advocating a greater level of censorship on social media. Isn't social media something which should be open to everybody, and that it should be free from the kind of censorship which has indeed impinged upon Facebook? And I find myself very unusually on the side of Facebook. Those claims that it has to reform itself and censor people.
I am in favour, to be honest, of censorship when it comes to spreading sort of false and malicious rumours about a global pandemic that has shut the world down and threatens to throw hundreds of millions into poverty. Yeah, I am in favour of censorship, but that's not my principal point. My principal point actually is a different one, which is that we need to get wise and we need to use not censorship, but aggressive, if you like, re-information, where we go into the same forums where the disinformation is being spread, and to do it as charismatically and effectively. And what's happened is that in the same way that in 2016 and 2019, the extreme right were able to kind of outflank the mainstream media by going to social media, so we need to stop that happening around the conspiracy theories around coronavirus, or you'll find that this 25-30% of the population who are, vivid anti-vaxxers and so forth, and who genuinely believe all these kind of crazy conspiracies will remain in place because they're not being challenged on Instagram. So it's all very well for the BBC and the FT to be winning the game in the mainstream media, but what are we doing in social? And I don't think the government's done well there.
Yeah, no, I see that. I mean, the 5G and the virus was an early conspiracy theory, and to this day, media. I mean, the 5G virus linkage, the ludicrous assertion that 5G was in some way transmitting the coronavirus, which has been combated pretty robustly on social media. And you also have Twitter at the moment banning people right, left and centre for
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear some of that. There's something. Maybe your 5G connection has been interfered.
It's that virus again.
I think what you were saying is that there's been a robust demolition of the 5G theories, and to which I would say, follow some conspiracy theorists on Instagram, because they're still pumping it out, and I think it's still powerful and it's still out there. And I think it's symptomatic of a sort of wider interesting phenomenon that we kind of live in the network age, because we have a disease that functions by a kind of form of network viral marketing, and we have social media, which is a form of viral marketing which uses the network to disseminate it, and now the network itself is under attack, which is kind of an interesting sort of side point, but nonetheless indicative of the fact that all these things are solved by aggressive intervention in the network, and I don't think we've yet achieved that.
It's a beautiful metaphor, Alex, of the two entities attacked by a virus. We'll move on, and thanks very much, Dr. Connor. We've now got Professor Vicky Price talking about the cost of this virus, which I think is going to be fairly extreme. Vicky Price is a visiting professor at BCU and a board member of the CBR, joint chief economist at Her Majesty's Government for previously the Society of Professional Economists and a companion of the British Institute of Management, and many, many more things, Vicky, as please give us your take on this.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking to you from Greece, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. This is, of course, the country which I think in Europe had the lowest cases of deaths from coronavirus. I think just over 200, which is quite extraordinary, and they've been relaxing right now. So I've been hearing, of course, what all the other experts on the panel have been saying about how badly, by comparison, the UK had done. But I think in terms of what they did to save the economy, or at least so far to keep the economy going, they've done the right thing. There is absolutely no way, in my view, that we could have avoided linking the health issues with what was going on in the economy as well. You couldn't have just kept going. Even if we had done what Sweden had done and had very minimal lockdowns, if you like, or minimal restrictions, they have suffered economically just as much as everybody else, because of course all around them others were closing down. If you look at what's been going on in the travel sector, aviation industry, borders closing, there is no way that the UK could have just carried on as before without having a hit. And this hit is very significant because of course what the government has done is affect both supply and demand in the economy by telling people to go and work from home or not work at all, because in many cases you can't work from home. Then it affected supply of goods and services in the economy, and by telling people they couldn't go out on the head to, if they wanted to shop for food from home mostly, or just go to the supermarkets or use online, that has reduced very significantly the demand in the economy. So it was a double whammy. And it's very interesting when you look at the cost to all of us, taxpayers, of course, of this, because the government has had to intervene very significantly, and compare that with what happened at the time of the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, when I was still working for the government. What you saw then was that it was a shock, but we were throwing everything possible on the economy to get it moving, not necessarily knowing whether it would work or not, but certainly increasing liquidity. Quantitative easing was done in a big scale, support to banks, of course, to keep them going and keep on lending to businesses, thinking of all sorts of ways to encourage employment and trade. It's easy to do when no one else is necessarily shut down like we have seen now, because at the beginning, of course, of our crisis, China had already closed down. There was no demand for goods and services from there. Supply chains were interrupted. So it's not very surprising that we need to borrow as much as we do. And this borrowing for this year alone is likely to be somewhere between 300 billion to 350 billion, the sort of figures that you wouldn't have dreamed of 10 years ago. You didn't even think about those numbers being as high as that just a few months ago. Remember the March 11 budget, the new Chancellor just presenting his budget. He had, of course, allocated some 30 billion extra to fight the crisis, the coronavirus crisis that was just beginning to be felt in the UK. But also at the same time, he decided he would be borrowing something like 55 billion more in order to push the economy the way the manifesto was suggesting of the new Conservative government under Boris Johnson. And they were going to carry on borrowing through the next few years in order to level up the regions. You remember all that? Huge infrastructure expectations that were going to be transforming the north, transforming loads of other regions of the UK, and reduce the inequality that we had between London and the rest. Well, all that, of course, may disappear, because a lot of that 500 extra billion over the course of the parliament that was going to be borrowed, mainly for capital spending, has already been borrowed or will have been borrowed by the end of this financial year. And that, of course, is quite frightening when you think of it. But look what's happening. The economy in March was expected to grow this year by 1.1%. It had been revised down. In fact, some others thought it may just be 0.8%. There were still concerns about Brexit and what the impact would be. Now, of course, everyone is talking about Brexit again, but let's see what happens at the end of the transition period. But at the time, it was assumed that we have an orderly free trade agreement at the end of the year. We were still only going to grow by about 1.1%. Well, what are the forecasts now, just a few months later? That we're going to see GDP decline by 13%, if we're lucky, in 2020, and then grow quite fast, hopefully, in a sort of V-shape from a very low base, unfortunately, and we may not get back to where we were before until 2024. What happens when the economy shrinks, as it is doing, is that obviously the government isn't collecting enough revenue, and obviously it has to pay more in terms of unemployment benefits, other welfare benefits, and so on. And that accounts by itself, without doing anything, for something like 100 billion of this 300 to 350 billion extra that we will have to borrow, which, as I said before, compares with just 55 billion we were going to borrow, we thought, back in March. I have a dog which has decided really rather likes this, what I'm saying, and it's decided to bark. Apologies about this. I can't do anything about it right now. So, in addition, of course, to what would be happening normally, the things that we call automatic fiscal stabilizers in economics, we have all this direct stimulus which is being given by the government. And one of the criticisms you could make is that they didn't really know how much this direct stimulus should be from the very beginning. But it is what happens in crisis. You just don't know how much more you may need to do. And the government has been coming back with more and more and more. So originally thought they might do something with the job retention scheme. Fine. And then he had to extend it by a few more months. Then, of course, the self-employed, it had to extend that too. Delayed payments of VAT, delayed payments of self-assessment tax, delayed or gave holidays for business rates. And we've seen more and more of that emerge, including in the July statement, an extra 30 billion for extending or giving further bribes, if you like, mainly to firms for keeping people on after the furlough scheme ends, because they fear that unemployment will rise very significantly. And the fears are that it could rise to something like 10 or 11%. So it's not surprising, therefore, that all those extra fiscal measures, which add up to something like 200 billion, are there and will be counted for some time to come as the type of debt that we have acquired that we're going to have to pay back at some point. The question then I will leave us with is, what happens in future years when some of that extra help is reduced? Obviously, finances improve a bit in the sense of the deficit to GDP ratio coming down on a yearly basis, but the debt will still pile on. Do we need to worry? Interest rates at which we borrow are very, very low at present. So we could carry on borrowing for quite some time unless the markets change their minds. And that's one of the concerns that people have, that if interest rates suddenly start going up because we are perceived perhaps not to be able to sustain this, then of course we'll be in trouble. But what do we have on our side? And that's where I'll finish. We have a central bank in the shape of the Bank of England, which is very prepared and has been to buy all those bonds we issue in the secondary market, which is called quantitative easing. And how much quantitative easing is the Bank of England going to do just this year? You've guessed it, 300 billion, which means that it can buy and hoover up the entire of the extra debt we have to issue this year. As long as the Bank of England is there and safe and sound, we'll be safe and sound too.
Brilliant, thanks a lot, Vicky. That's remarkably cheerful news from Greece, and lovely to hear your dog as well. For bond issue and also tax rises, possibly for those who are very well off, seems to be the two main ways in which we might dig ourselves out of this. Does that sound about right?
Well, there are a number of ways in which we can dig ourselves out of this. We can have growth. If you have fast growth, then obviously the debt to GDP ratio is reduced. And also, if you remember, I spoke about the fiscal stabilizers, the automatic stabilizers, they move the other way. You start receiving more in terms of tax. Or you can have higher inflation. And that, of course, eats the real value of the debt and brings it down. So that's fine. We can do that too. The chances, of course, of the second are not very great because for the moment, we're more likely to have deflation across the world rather than inflation. So the only other way then, once we start worrying about how we'll ever repay this or reduce this debt, assuming we really want to as a share of GDP, is indeed to look at taxes. And you're quite right. There is now quite a lot of talk about possible capital gains tax being reformed, all sorts of other loopholes being closed, looking at wealth tax more generally. Of course, politically, a number of these things are not very palatable. And the base at present of this government, of course, they also have the sort of red areas which have turned conservative, but those may well prove to be very temporary. But otherwise, their base, which is older people owning their homes, probably quite middle class in many areas, are not going to like this very much. So they have to be subtle about this. But the problem is that the only way to raise tax in any significant fashion, which will make a dent to that debt, is by taxing everybody. So increasing income tax, national insurance contributions would be probably the only way, if you rely on tax, that this debt can come down.
Vicky, thanks a lot. I ought to mention, as I don't get my say on this really, that my own party, the Social Democratic Party, is in favour of a war bond to help dig us out of this crisis. So vote SDP. With that, I will move on, because we wouldn't be in this financial hole if the world, not merely our government, hadn't reacted with which is a lovely description, I always think. Brendan, you think we've got it all wrong?
Yes, I do. I think the great catastrophe in the UK over the past 4 months is very simple, as far as I can see, which is that we locked down healthy people who are at little risk from COVID-19, and we failed to lock down older or unhealthy people who are at risk from COVID-19. And I think that's our catastrophe summed up. And the reason that's the catastrophe is because by locking down the general population, including healthy people under the age of 40, for whom COVID-19 poses a very, very small risk. I say this as someone who has had COVID-19. I've donated plasma to the NHS because people who've had COVID-19 ought to do that. And I would encourage everyone who's had it to do that. It's unpleasant. It's not nice. In my case, it lasted a couple of weeks, but it is an entirely manageable ailment in people of a certain age. To lock down generally healthy, youngish people for a period of 3 or 4 months so that they cannot be working in factories, driving buses, educating children, and doing things that a society needs in order to keep going, I think was a complete and utter disaster. Alongside that, we failed to lock down the people who we did know, and we certainly know now, are at great risk from COVID-19, which is people over the age of 70, particularly those who have underlying health conditions. So, as people have already said, we threw elderly people back into care homes with very little regard for whether they had COVID-19 or not. So why did we do these two things? Why did we lock down healthy people and fail to lock down potentially unhealthy people? We did that not because Boris is a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian, not because of British exceptionalism, not because of Brexit and all those other reasons that people push around. We did that because of the culture of fear. And we did that because the fear of COVID-19 became deranged. And both of those measures we took, the locking down of healthy people and the failing to lock down potentially unhealthy people, sprung from the politics of fear. So it was when Ferguson's nutty figures came out, about 500,000 people dying, that we said we need to lock down the entire population with no regard whatsoever for what impact that would have on economic life. I agree with Vicky that it would have been difficult for Britain to escape economic consequences given what was happening globally, particularly in Europe, but we certainly made our economic situation worse by enforcing our own incredibly strict lockdown and the shutdown of economic life, essentially. So we locked down as a fearful response to these modelled figures, and a model, of course, is not scientific proof, it's not evidence, it is merely a model. As John Lee has said, Dr. John Lee says, it is essentially an opinion. It might be an opinion that comes with pie charts, but it is still an opinion. And we locked down the healthy working population and we brought economic life to a standstill. That is going to plunge us into an unprecedented recession, which will mean less investment in health services, less investment in house building, less investment in social services and education, which will have the knock-on effect of making people ill and potentially lowering life expectancy. We know that some people have died as a consequence of lockdown. There have been numerous reports about increased numbers of deaths from heart attack, a number of people dying from heart attacks at home, higher than normal, presumably because those people are reluctant to impose on the health service. And we know that cancer treatment has been largely suspended, and many people are concerned about the storing up of cancer deaths and cancer problems in the future. So the lockdown of the healthy population has had a significant impact on life and the future. And the failure to lock down the elderly population was likewise driven by a culture of fear. It was driven by the mantra that we had to protect the NHS. We had to protect the NHS to such an extent that it was fine to throw an 85-year-old woman out of an NHS hospital back into her care home so that we could free up beds in the NHS. Why did we need to free up beds in the NHS? Because there was a predicted plague, there was a predicted unprecedented epidemic, because of Ferguson's figures of 500,000 dead which led the Public Health England and the NHS more broadly to think that hospitals would be swamped and that anyone in a hospital had to be expelled unless they had COVID-19. And that is what contributed to the care homes crisis. It wasn't uncaring attitudes among senior Tories, it was the culture of fear. It was this idea that the NHS would be swamped by the worst disease of modern times. So the culture of fear, I think, has proven utterly disastrous for this country. And I would say that we cannot we have to see our response to COVID in the context of the contemporary culture, particularly the fashion for apocalypticism, the culture of fear, this notion that everything that happens is going to be a complete and utter disaster. And this is not an original point. Susan Sontag wrote a wonderful essay in 1978 called Illness as Metaphor, and then she followed it up in 1989 with an essay called AIDS and its Metaphors. And she made the point that illness is never just illness. It is always baggaged with the expectations of society or the fears of society or the metaphors of society. I think we now have to look at COVID and its metaphors. And COVID has become a metaphor for an irrational fear of disease, an irrational fear of other people, and a willingness to ramp up the culture of fear with very little regard for the impact that it has on human life. And I think when we come to inquire, when we have the official inquiry into COVID-19, we will have to look at the government's failings, of course we will, Public Health England's failings, but I think we also ought to look at the way in which the politics of fear is not just irritating and annoying and makes people feel scared, but in this instance, it has cost people's lives.
Brendan, thanks a lot, mate. Isn't a fear of disease rational rather than irrational? And given that this happened across the entire world, the minority of the virus, the gravitas which it has gained for itself universally across the world, with the possible exception of Brazil, everyone has come to take this virus very seriously indeed, and 60,000 people in Britain have died.
I'm not sure that fear of disease is rational. I think certainly it's rational to be cautious in particular situations. Like, for example, over the past 3 or 4 months, very few people would have engaged in a large public gathering that would have been considered unwise. But I think it's also unwise to go through life fearing possible infection, because I think that fear also has a detrimental impact on people's quality of life. When I think back to 3 or 4 months ago, at the start of this thing, the terror that was inflicted upon the population by the government and also by the media. I mean, the media just had these ceaseless, endless horror stories from Italy and other countries where I know so many people who stopped watching the news because it was genuinely impacting on their mental health. And I think what people were crying out for was a rational assessment of the genuine level of threat according to age and according to underlying health conditions, and a rational assessment of how safe it was for particular forms of work to carry on and for particular forms of life to carry on. Instead, what they got was this blanket message that if you leave your house, you will kill someone. I mean, that is almost what they were told. If you go outside, you will be responsible for an old person's death. And the government and the media terrorized the population. And I think it will take a long time for the UK to recover from that campaign of terror.
Brendan, thanks a lot, mate. Thank you. One of the things that has been talked about in the media, especially a couple of months ago, was the increased vulnerability of Black and ethnic minority British people. Appalling word. Professor Barney Chowdhury, the communications consultant, writes for Eastern Eye and Britain's #1 stage national newspaper. BBC for many years, an old colleague of mine and a good friend, and he's Professor of Professional Practice at the University of Buckingham. Barney. You need to come off mute, old chum. You need to come off mute.
Got it. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
It's been a long
Good
time.
to have you with us.
So, as I was saying, my submission is not going to be about the government's faults as such, but how we journalists got it wrong and may well get it wrong next time. So I'm not going to be very popular, I don't think, Rod. No, you know, journalists are storytellers, aren't they? And here's mine of yours. You made my career because you championed me. And what I'm about to say is going to sound contradictory, but I think our profession is structurally, systemically, and institutionally racist. Let me explain. In an interview for my newspaper, Eastern Eye, the Brent Central MP Dawn Butler explained it like this. If you took a person of colour and a white colleague and asked them to run 100 metres, it would seem fair. But for the BAME person, no one will tell them that theirs will be a 100 metres hurdle, not a sprint. Don't get me wrong, breathe a little. Things have improved since I began my career in 1981. But we're still getting it wrong, and it's important because if we don't start to get it right on a permanent basis, we won't be able to do what the rest of the panel has been talking about, holding government truly to account. And what do I mean by that? Well, in February, when COVID took off, I noticed the memorial wall of death was predominantly Black or Asian. So I pitched several ideas about how we should cover this to several broadcasters, and I did not get one single response. And it wasn't until 5 weeks later that we read and saw the first reports about disproportionate deaths, not in the UK, but in the United States. Luckily, my newspaper did notice because it's in its DNA. And the first question it asks, how does this story affect South Asian or BAME communities? And that starting point is the difference between mainstream and minority papers, so we can hold power to account in a different way. And in the past 6 months, we've had a steady stream of exclusive stories which have been followed up. And for those who don't know, this newspaper was started in a living room floor by a pioneer called Ramneeklal Solanki. And they weren't puff pieces that he produced. He, Ramneeklal Solanki, wanted to reflect the community's warts and for all. And when he died in February this year, his sons, Kalpesh and Sailesh, picked up the baton, and they're truly unafraid of reflecting the good, the bad, the ugly. And Rod, you know that I get into trouble for my journalism, sometimes from Asians. And so it takes brave editors to defend the journalism of unpalatable truths. And I'm going to be quick about this because we've seen a plethora of race reporting recently, but I say this from experience, it ain't going to last. The circus has moved on. We're not asking the right questions when it comes to non-white people. We're not seeking the appropriate data. We're not mapping. We're blithely accepting what we're being told by government. And that's the main point. Our job is to hold power to account. And unless we have that diversity of people, that diversity of thought, we ain't going to get the full picture.
Is it, as an old Marxist myself, I always devolve to the idea that our flaws are basically class-based, because, of course, it was also the very poor white people who copped this virus. The virus was brought over here largely by the affluent, but the people who suffered were the poor. Is it not more a case of poverty than race, Barney?
I think it's a bit of both as well. So we are missing the idea. So if you think about what the narrative has been over the last few weeks, the predilection to concentrate on Leicester, Luton, Blackburn, it's always been those South Asian areas. But what we're not looking at, and you're quite right, is the deprived area as well. So it's about this idea of holding government to account and asking those vital questions. Why are those areas, whatever the areas are, being the ones that are going to be dying from COVID as a result of neglect, as a result of not being able to get the proper medical attention, living in houses of multiple occupation?
Got you. I think we're going to take some questions now because we don't have much time left. One of them is over the scandal of the Nightingale hospitals. Questions from both Trixie Sanderson and Angie Stone. Should the Nightingales change their admissions criteria when it became apparent that there were not enough people meeting them to have anywhere near the need for the number of the beds? Change these criteria.
Rod, unfortunately, your microphone's really distorted, so we've not been able to understand the questions. So forgive us.
Sorry, the Nightingale hospitals. Can people hear this? Okay. David Leon, if you can hear me, should we have built them in the first case? And in the second case, should their admissions criteria have been changed?
I think it was probably a prudent move to build them. I think it would have been what we can't actually, what perhaps the panelists, including me, I'm not a medical doctor, I haven't been on the front line. Nobody here has been on the front line. I think the impact of seeing your A&E hospital, A&E departments filling up, your ICUs filling up with conditions not responding to normal treatment must have been very terrifying. And I think, I imagine that some of the communication coming from practicing clinicians would have also made a big impact at the heart of government in terms of what was being seen on the front line. The question of whether or not they should have been repurposed, I suspect this, as I say, I'm not a clinician. I think they were built specifically for a particular purpose, which is to take people who required ventilation. I think in Scotland, for instance, they are now being repurposed slightly to take some of the strain from the NHS in terms of a number of specialties, dermatology and so on, where people can be seen in a hospital setting, but they don't require quite such diverse treatment facilities. So I think it was the prudent thing to do. In retrospect, it looked as though they weren't required, but I must say, if I was in government, I would hang on to them for the winter too, which they're going to do.
Thanks a lot. I also ought to introduce as well another expert witness, Peter Wells. Now, Peter is a data policy and delivery expert who works to make technology benefit everyone. Has worked in the policy team at the Open Data Institute, working on stuff like data infrastructure, digital competition, and so on, and has spent 20 years working with the telecoms business. Peter, what do you have to tell us about the way in which the government has gone about this?
Hi there. So I've been asked to talk about the contact tracing app, which was all over the news in the summer and then disappeared off the Isle of Wight. So I suppose for the viewers, so for the listeners there, that the contact tracing app was in a pandemic, you need to find out who has the disease or who might have the disease. So you can help, I suppose, put in some of those targeted measures, focusing on who might have it. It's a classic pandemic response or classic sexual health response as well in many cases. Now, academics and scientists were worried back in February, March that coronavirus would spread too fast because people were passing on the disease even if they weren't showing any symptoms. So contact tracing would be overwhelmed. So the idea came up of using smartphones and of saying that by seeing if smartphones were close to each other, that could let us know if somebody had the pandemic, had the disease or not, and therefore whether they should isolate or not. Now, when that idea came along, government started building it. And Google and Apple, they got interested in this and they said they'll build their own version as well because they wanted to take control of this thing and make sure it aligned with their interests in making sure we all kept buying and using our smartphones. But other technologists and public health experts were saying, hang on, this might not actually work. You know, I've got my smartphone, I might leave it sitting on a desk. I might leave it in my handbag while I go to the toilet. I might, the use of a smartphone by a frontline doctor is very different, or a bus driver is very different to somebody who's just going down the shops. And that might create some strange behavior and some strange expectations. So people like myself were saying this could be we should be a bit cautious about this and not guarantee it's going to be the big thing. But then during the summer, it became a very big thing. You know, I'd see it regularly on the questions from the ministers every day. They'd be answering questions about the app. There'd be lots of debates about the app. There were umpteen thousand news stories dominating my feed and questions coming in. And eventually government started to trial the app, which is good. You know, if you've got an idea, you have to try it, see if it works, see if it doesn't. And they tried it on the Isle of Wight. And again, there it was quite hard to work out what was going on at that point. So there's lots of speculation. There were people with conspiracy theories of the app, linking it up to the 5G conspiracy theory, linking it up to Brexit conspiracy theories, linking it up to all sorts of nonsense and stuff, because there wasn't much official information about what was going on, despite the fact it was being trialled on 140,000 people. And then when it was trialled, we didn't get any updates from the trial. Journalists there were asking, people were saying, what's happening? Is it working? Is it not? And nothing came back. And then eventually a health minister, Lord Bethell, reported that actually people wanted to listen to a human about whether they should isolate rather than a machine. Now, I might be willing to use a smartphone if I'm in a strange town to find my way to the nearest pub. I'm less likely to listen to a smartphone if it tells me to stay at home for 2 weeks and not get paid. So that started to emerge, and then more silence after that. Government said they might still launch it. And then eventually it emerged that the technology didn't actually work because government wasn't using the same model that had been built by Google and Apple. We build all the smartphones. So it didn't work because Google and Apple really didn't want it to work. They wanted to use their own technology and do their things. And at the same time, we had all of the problems that Barney talked about, Steve talked about, you know, places like meat packing plants, with care homes, with hospitals, the excess deaths of I think it's 65,000 now excess deaths in the UK, all while parts of government have been focused on this app rather than building more functional systems. I suppose that's that kind of lesson we need to take from it, to stop looking for some of these easy solutions based on smartphones and technology, and start looking for these more institutional and complex responses that can, I suppose, save a few more lives and get society working again.
Peter, thanks a lot. Are you hearing me reasonably well at the moment?
I am, yes.
Just one question, which is really, is this a systemic problem, do you think, with the UK and technology? Is this something which we haven't invested enough money in, despite having been initially world leaders in this kind of technology? Is this why we're getting it wrong? Underfunding?
It's probably not underfunding. The UK government is spending a lot of money on technology. It seems to more be we're distracted by the shiny things and not realizing how long it actually takes to build good technology. I mean, other countries are trialing apps now, but they built the systems first. So they built the human-based systems first and then started layering technology on top. We went a bit too early for the easy answer.
Right. I've got a question for Alex. Alex Connock, if you can hear me, Alex. This is the kind of point which Brendan was making, which is from William Lynn. Have the government and scientific advisors largely ignored human rights, civil liberties and personal freedoms during the lockdown? And for Paul Ellis, at which point does a cure become worse than a disease? And how on earth do we recognise when that point is reached?
I think the first point, no, I just don't agree that the government has ignored civil liberties. I'm so sorry, but I don't agree. What was the second point?
How do we, when do we reach the point when the cure becomes worse than the disease, i.e. we've heard about more people with heart disease and indeed cancer suffering as a consequence of lockdown and the effects of lockdown?
I think that's a public health question, and I think that you'd probably find, better qualified people on this panel to answer. Actually, I think I'm more concerned with the specifics of the, if you like, information war. But I think for example, Professor Leon might have a better answer than me to that one.
Well, yeah. Okay, Dave, if you're still listening.
Yeah, I'm still listening. I mean, the latest I think undoubtedly one thing we can say is some people will have died because they've had a myocardial infarction and they in pre-pandemic they'd have lived. I don't think we've been able to estimate that. There are a lot of process measures, i.e. the numbers of people who presented for certain kind of procedures. I'm sure there's some element of that. I think undoubtedly there are going to be some people over the next 3-4 years who will die of cancer. as a result of delayed diagnosis. The latest analysis from my own institution suggests 3,500 people over a 3-year period. So that's 3,500 deaths, which shouldn't really happen. However, I still think this question of the collateral deaths, I don't think we've properly understood it. And my view is that there's a very large number of apparent collateral deaths in care homes. The excess deaths, i.e. the number of deaths occurring in care homes on a weekly basis compared to the previous 5 years, is very high in care homes and much higher than the COVID deaths. But how many of those are actually concealed COVID deaths is the really important thing. We're doing some work on that at the moment. A lot of other people are. I suspect the collateral deaths are overemphasized, and what we've probably got is an undercount of the number of deaths from COVID-19, particularly in the early phase of the pandemic when it wasn't fully recognized.
Dave, thanks. Brendan, I think you were going.
Yeah, I actually think the collateral deaths, which is an unfortunate phrase, are being possibly underestimated. The United Nations today says that 10,000 children are dying a month from coronavirus restrictions in relation to, and I mean 10,000 children in the developing world, because of the global restrictions that have been put on trade, production, the creation of food, the transportation of food, and so on. We can't afford to be cavalier about this. We can't afford to be cavalier about the consequences not only of COVID-19, and we all know the consequences of COVID-19, it has claimed a huge number of lives, but we also cannot afford to be cavalier about the impact of man's response to COVID-19. And in the UK context, that it will lead to collateral deaths from cancer, huge number of job losses, unemployment, and possible decline in life expectancy. In the developing world, it will have far graver consequences. The UN, 10,000 children dying a month already, a huge amount of worklessness, people losing their livelihoods, and in the developing world, that means early death. So we have to be real about this, and we have to, instead of simply saying the government mismanaged COVID-19, we also have to look at the possibility that the response to COVID-19 is also having grave consequences. And you know, the medical experts amongst us, I am not one of them, will know that the motto is first do no harm. And we have to ask whether our response to COVID-19 has done some pretty bad harm.
Brendan, thanks. One final question, which I think I'll put to Juliet, if that's all right. If you can hear me okay, Juliet. This is from Todd Wells, who I suspect is not necessarily a member of the Conservative Party. Does the panel agree that Boris's obsession with a Brexit-only team has led to a limited pool of talent, some of which are incompetent sycophants? And does the panel agree that these lightweights have led to the fiasco in the mismanagement of the coronavirus? I'm going to leave that to you, Juliet.
Do I agree? Well, yes. Basically, I do agree. I mean, I think a lot of quite clever people were kicked out of the Tory party because they didn't agree on Brexit. Now, whether you agree on Brexit or not is not the whole story about whether you are going to be good in government. And the problem is that if you limit yourself to people who are going to do your bidding, you are limiting your choice quite severely. Some of the current lot do seem to be quite lightweight and do seem to be quite confused about their own message. The communication has been dire. Even ministers haven't known whether you're supposed to wear a mask here or whether you're not. We've had ministers just not being able to answer the question. We had a minister on the Today programme, I can't actually remember which one it was, who didn't seem to know that public health officers existed in local authorities, even though, as Nick Robinson put it, they had been in the newspapers for 15 days. I mean, I do think there's a big problem here, and if you don't believe in experts and you don't believe in getting in a range of people in your government, and you're looking for people who are going to do what Number 10 wants them to do and who will accept the advisors that Dominic Cummings chooses, then you're going to get a group of people who are far more yes men and far less capable of thinking for themselves, challenging the thinking of of other people in the government, and therefore you're going to get a much less robust debate and a much less robust response, especially when you have something as difficult as this.
Thanks a lot, Juliet. The range is still far too broad for me as far as Brexit is concerned, but that's another issue, and we'll probably have to agree to differ on it, I think. Could I just thank every single panellist? Thank you so much for spending your time with us, and thanks for all that wonderful input. I know there's a lot more to say on this issue. We've gone through most of the questions. If you want to know any more about it, don't forget this book, which is The Pandemic, and which has many of the speakers today involved in writing chapters. Thanks a lot for this, and thanks to John Mayer, and apologies if my voice sounded awful. I'm practicing to be Tom Waits at the moment. Good night, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We must not forget what we can all do to fight this virus, which is to wash our hands. You knew I was going to say this, but wash our hands with soap and water. And forgive me.
Okay, how long should I wash them?
For the length of time it takes to sing Happy Birthday twice.
Right, okay, wash hands for length of time it takes to sing Happy Birthday twice.
Happy birthday twice.
Okay, anything else?
I want to stress that for the vast majority of the people of this country, we should be going about our business as usual.
Oh, okay, business as usual then. Back to the day job.
There's been a bit of confusing advice about things like shaking hands.
Where's the confusion? Obviously, everyone should avoid doing that.
No, well, Victoria, I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
Oh, right. So actually, it's fine to go to a hospital full of coronavirus patients and shake hands with absolutely everybody. Is that right?
I think the scientific evidence is, well, I'll hand over to the experts, but our judgment is wash. Washing your hands is the crucial thing.
Yeah, wash your hands while you sing Happy Birthday twice.
Before you shake hands, obviously.
Yes, right, but not after. Got it.
Downing Street has just confirmed that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has tested positive for a coronavirus.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been admitted to hospital.
Britain's Prime Minister is in intensive care this morning after his fight with the coronavirus took a troubling turn.
In the UK, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has left intensive care after 3 nights.
Boris Johnson is now out of the hospital just days after being released from intensive care.
I've today left hospital after a week in which the NHS has saved my life, no question.